They sealed this house after the guillotine stopped. Decades later, people complained that its floors were warm, that the air smelled clean and rotten at the same time. When workers finally tore the boards up, they realized the wood was not stained. It was saturated, not just with blood, but with the calm of the men who spilled it. The executions ended. The executioners died. But the house kept working. The house breathed before it was ever seen, long before anyone stood in front of its doors or traced the lines of its windows with cautious eyes. On certain nights, when Paris lay damp and sleepless under a sky the color of old pewter, a sweetness leaked into the street like a confession pressed through clenched teeth. It slid low along the stones, warm and intimate, carrying the scent of soap boiled too long and iron left to steep in rainwater. The smell did not rush or announce itself. It waited, gathered, then spread, seeping beneath shutters and through keyholes until neighbors woke choking, their mouths tasting faintly of metal, convinced that somewhere inside the wall something was being washed again and never made clean. The house stood on the city's edge, where cobblestones thinned and gardens surrendered to mud. By day it looked respectable, even restrained. Pale stone facade, tall windows, a modest iron gate that rarely creaked. But at night it changed weight. The air around it grew dense, almost viscous, pressing against the chest of anyone who passed too close. Street lamps nearby burned with an unsteady flame, their light bending strangely along the walls as if absorbed rather than reflected. Those who lived nearby learned to recognize the nights when the house exhaled. Dogs whimpered and refused to pass. Laundry left hanging absorbed the odor and could not be fully rinsed no matter how many times it was scrubbed. Wooden shutters swelled and stuck, swollen by moisture that had no visible source. Even stone steps developed a faint sheen, slick beneath bare feet, warm despite the cold. Inside, the house held its breath. Windows stayed dark, curtains unmoving, yet the silence felt occupied. Floors retained heat long after footsteps should have faded, and the walls released a low, almost inaudible hum, like pressure trapped beneath skin. The scent grew stronger near the base of the structure, pooling around thresholds and drains, clinging to the mortar between stones as if the building itself were secreting it. Paris in the year 1794 was already saturated with fear. The city had learned the sound of carts at dawn, the rhythm of crowds, the clean fall of a blade. Blood had become a public thing, spilled efficiently, discussed casually, washed from hands with lye and water before supper. Yet this house carried something different. The smell that bled from it was not sharp or raw. It was domestic, familiar, the odor of cleansing taken too far, of repetition without release. Neighbors whispered prayers and closed their windows. Some claimed the scent followed them into sleep, threading through dreams of red-stained floors and hands scrubbed to the bone. Others swore the house shifted subtly when unobserved, its walls flexing, its foundations settling as though adjusting to a weight that was never removed. No official records mentioned the building. No plaques marked its purpose. Yet the street learned to avoid it instinctively, stepping wide, holding breath. Whatever lived inside those walls did not scream or weep. It worked patiently, methodically, and the house, already awake, learned how to keep it all. The year was 1794, and the terror no longer shouted. It worked quietly now, with schedules, ledgers, and sharpened routines that began before sunrise and ended only when the sky bruised into purple and ash. The guillotine stood in its square like a tool finally perfected, its wood scrubbed pale, its blade honed to a brightness that caught the morning light without reflection. Crowds still gathered, but even they had learned restraint. The screams were fewer, shorter, clipped by precision, swallowed by the rhythm of repetition. Those who operated the machine had become specialists. They moved with economy, conserving motion, conserving breath. Hands that once trembled now tied, lifted, released with the same calm practiced by butchers and surgeons. At dusk they washed thoroughly, lye biting into skin, soap foaming gray, blood dissolving into water that ran pink, then clear. When the carts rolled away and the square emptied, they were no longer needed as public figures. They were given a place to sleep far from the center, a house at the edge of Paris where no one would ask questions and no one would watch them closely. The house had tall windows and polished floors. It had been chosen for its discretion, wide enough to hold several men, modest enough not to attract attention. Each evening they arrived with clean boots, careful not to track mud inside, careful not to look back at the city behind them. Their coats were brushed, their hands still faintly raw from scrubbing. Yet something followed them regardless, an invisible weight clinging to hems and cuffs, settling into the grain of the wood as they crossed the threshold. The first nights passed without incident. The men ate quietly, slept heavily, and rose before dawn to return to the square. But the house did not cool when they left. Even in the absence of bodies, warmth lingered in the rooms, a soft pressure beneath the floors, as though the structure had absorbed the heat of their presence and refused to release it. By morning, the air carried a faint sweetness that had no clear source, subtle enough to ignore, persistent enough to return. As days folded into weeks, the house learned them. It memorized the rhythm of boots on stairs, the pause at landings, the weight of bodies collapsing into chairs. The floorboards began to yield in familiar places, bowing slightly where men stood to remove coats, softening near beds where knees touched down in exhaustion. At night, when rain struck the roof or sudden warmth rolled in from the south, moisture surfaced along the seams of the wood, beading like sweat. The liquid was warm to the touch and left behind a scent that was impossible to mistake, copper dulled by time, soap rendered sweet by overuse. The men noticed but did not speak of it. Silence had become a habit. They slept deeply, yet woke unrefreshed, their skin slick as if they had labored through the night. Sheets clung damply to their backs. Dreams came thick and repetitive, filled with pressure rather than image, with the sensation of kneeling, lifting, releasing, over and over, without sound. In the mornings they washed again, scrubbing harder, chasing a cleanliness that never fully arrived. The cellar changed first. Its stone walls darkened permanently, as though soaked through. Water gathered without rain, forming shallow pools that reflected nothing clearly. Rats avoided the space entirely, skittering to a halt at the threshold before retreating, their bodies tense with instinct. The air below carried the scent more strongly, sweet and metallic, pressing into the lungs until breathing felt deliberate. Above, the floors began to respond. When the men returned at night, the house greeted them with warmth that rose through soles and bones, a low heat that pulsed faintly, synchronized to something internal. The boards creaked not with age but with recognition, adjusting under familiar weight. In certain rooms, the wood felt spongy, compressing and rebounding slowly, as if remembering bodies pressed hard against it in other circumstances, other postures. Outside, neighbors complained. They woke choking on the smell that slid into their homes, that clung to hair and cloth, that lingered even after windows were thrown open. Laundry absorbed it. Stone steps glistened faintly in the morning, slick and warm despite the cold. Dogs refused to pass the house, pulling hard at leashes, whining low in their throats. Inside, the men grew quieter. Meals were eaten quickly, appetite dulled by a constant taste of iron at the back of the mouth. Their shadows thickened, clinging close even in bright rooms. When they slept, the house worked. Moisture rose through the floors, through the beams, carrying with it what had been pressed down day after day in the square. Blood that had been washed from hands and boots returned in another form, not liquid but memory, seeping back into the space that held them. The house did not accuse. It did not scream or weep. It absorbed. Each night it drew the residue from their bodies, the calm required to do the work efficiently, the methodical peace that had settled into their muscles and minds. That calm pressed into the wood, into the stone, saturating it. By the time the terror slowed and the square fell quiet, the house was heavy with it. When the men finally left, summoned elsewhere or simply dismissed, the building did not empty. The warmth remained. The scent lingered. Floors continued to sweat when the weather shifted, releasing beads that smelled faintly of blood and soap. What had been brought there had not been removed. It had been taught to rest, to settle, to wait. At first the house seemed merely tired, the way old structures do when they have endured too much weather and too many occupants without complaint. Floorboards sagged slightly underfoot, not enough to alarm, just enough to suggest long use. Doors resisted the hand, their frames subtly warped, swollen by years of damp that never fully receded. Even in winter, when frost laced the streets and breath fogged the air, the interior remained warm, holding heat as if reluctant to release it back into the world. Visitors remarked on it in passing, attributing it to thick walls and good construction, unaware that the warmth did not behave like warmth should. Then the sweating began. It appeared first in the mornings, after nights of heavy rain or sudden, unnatural warmth. Thin beads of moisture surfaced along the seams of the wood, collecting where floorboards met, where stairs joined landings, where walls pressed against beams. At first the liquid carried a faint tint, a diluted red that could be mistaken for rust or residue from old pipes. It glistened briefly in the light, then ran clear, leaving behind a smell that clung stubbornly to the air, copper softened by time and lye boiled down to sweetness. Servants were summoned. Buckets were filled, brushes scraped and cloths darkened. Arms shook with the effort of scrubbing wood that seemed to resist cleanliness itself. The liquid wiped away easily, too easily, but the scent remained, embedded in the grain. By midday the floors looked dry, respectable once more. By evening, faint discolorations began to surface again, blooming slowly, like bruises rising beneath skin. The house did not sweat everywhere at once. Certain rooms were favored. Near the base of staircases, along the edges of bedrooms, in narrow corridors where bodies passed close to walls. The boards there grew soft over time, compressing slightly under weight, rebounding sluggishly when pressure lifted. Walking across them produced a muted sound, not a creak but a dampened sigh, as though the house were exhaling. Attempts were made to explain it. Damp foundations, faulty drainage, old timber. Each theory failed to account for the heat. Moisture should have brought cold, yet these areas remained warm to the touch, even in the depth of winter. When hands pressed flat against the floor, a faint pulse could be felt, subtle enough to dismiss as imagination, persistent enough to return whenever attention lingered. The walls joined in slowly. Plaster darkened in thin vertical lines, seeping from hairline cracks and corners. The liquid there dried tacky, leaving faint streaks that caught dust and resisted lime wash. The smell thickened, no longer content to linger near the floor. It rose, pressing into curtains, upholstery, clothing. Linen stored in cupboards emerged damp and scented faintly of iron, no matter how often it was aired. Those tasked with cleaning began to dread certain rooms, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. Scrubbing them left hands raw and aching, skin burning where soap bit too deep. Water hauled from the well ran cloudy after touching the floors, tinged faintly pink before settling clear again, as though something had dissolved into it briefly, then vanished. The house responded to attention. The more it was scrubbed, the more it released. Stains returned faster, spread wider, crept along seams previously untouched. It was not defiance. It was accommodation. The building had learned that this was how it was meant to behave now. In the cellar, the change was undeniable. Stone walls darkened permanently, their surfaces slick and warm. Moisture gathered in shallow pools that never fully evaporated, their surfaces unnaturally still. The scent there was concentrated, heavy enough to make breathing feel deliberate, each inhalation thick with sweetness and metal. Tools left overnight emerged damp, their handles darkened, their iron parts faintly tacky, as if brushed by residue that clung without visible source. Rats abandoned the space entirely. Traps remained untouched. Even insects avoided the threshold, gathering instead near the upper floors, where warmth drew them in, but something unseen drove them away from certain corners. The house began to mark time through its sweating. Sudden changes in weather triggered heavier release. A warm wind from the south brought beads overnight. A sharp frost followed by thaw produced rivulets that traced the same paths again and again, as if the building remembered where to let go. Each release carried the same scent, unchanged by repetition, unchanged by years. People learned to step carefully. Certain boards flexed alarmingly, sinking under weight before slowly rising again. Furniture placed in damp rooms developed warped legs, stains blooming beneath them like shadows. Carpets grew heavy and sour, impossible to fully dry, their fibers holding the smell no matter how they were beaten or aired. Those who slept in the house reported waking slick with moisture, sheets clinging unpleasantly to skin. Dreams were heavy and indistinct, filled with pressure rather than image, with the sensation of weight bearing down and lifting again, rhythm without sound. Morning washing never felt complete. The scent lingered on skin, in hair, in the back of the throat. Over time, the sweating ceased to alarm. It became a known behavior, something to be managed rather than questioned. Buckets were kept ready. Cloths were replaced often. Windows were opened even in winter, though the cold did little to dispel the warmth held within the walls and floors. What no one fully grasped was that the house was not leaking. It was expressing. The liquid that surfaced was not drawn from rain or ground, but from saturation deep within its structure. Blood had been pressed into the wood, into the beams and joists, day after day, absorbed slowly, patiently, until the material itself had changed. What rose to the surface now was not the whole of it, but an excess, a release prompted by shifts in pressure and heat. The stains returned because the source had never been removed. The house had been fed thoroughly, consistently, until it no longer knew how to be dry. Every board carried memory in its fibers. Every seam held residue pressed too deep to scrub away. The sweating was not decay. It was recall. And as the seasons turned and the years advanced, the house continued its quiet work, releasing just enough to remind anyone inside that what had been done there had not passed. It had settled. It had soaked in. And it would rise again, whenever conditions allowed, blooming slowly, patiently, like wounds that refused to close. As months passed, the house learned routines with the patience of something that did not need to hurry. It learned the timing of footsteps on the stairs, the brief pause at bedroom doors, the exact hours when bodies surrendered to sleep. The floors near those rooms changed first. Boards that had once been firm began to soften, their resistance giving way in slow increments. Weight pressed into them left shallow impressions that lingered longer than they should have, rebounding sluggishly, as if the wood were remembering bodies kneeling, slipping, collapsing in familiar patterns it had absorbed and stored. Each night deepened the knowledge. The house did not merely register presence, it cataloged it. The angle of a shoulder brushing past a doorframe, the pressure of bare feet settling beside beds, the repeated bend of knees where men leaned forward in exhaustion. These gestures pressed into the grain of the wood, into the fibers beneath polish and varnish, until movement itself became a permanent feature of the structure. In the cellar, the transformation settled into permanence. The stone walls darkened completely, no longer blooming and fading with weather, but remaining slick and warm regardless of season. Moisture clung to them like a second skin, beating but never dripping, as if held in place by intention rather than gravity. The air there thickened until each breath felt deliberate, heavy with the familiar sweetness of soap and the dull metallic edge of blood rendered old. Lantern flames burned low and unsteady, bending toward the walls as though drawn by heat. Rats refused to enter. They gathered at the top of the cellar steps, bodies tense, whiskers twitching, then scattered as if repelled by a force that could not be seen. Traps set along the perimeter remained untouched, bait drying and rotting in place. The cellar had become a void, occupied by something that required no movement to assert itself. Above ground, the men who slept in the house began to change. Not dramatically, not in ways that demanded immediate concern. They simply woke exhausted. Sleep came easily, heavy and uninterrupted, yet offered no restoration. Limbs felt weighted, muscles sore as if strained through effort unremembered. Skin carried a faint slickness, a thin film that coated arms, necks, backs, smelling faintly of blood and soap, as though they themselves had been washed by the building while they dreamed. Morning rituals intensified. Water was heated longer. Scrubbing became harsher. Lye bit into skin until knuckles cracked and bled, yet the scent persisted, subtle but unmistakable, rising again as soon as cloth and brush were set aside. The men dressed carefully, pulling on clean shirts that absorbed the smell within minutes, the fabric warming against skin in a way that felt intimate and invasive. Dreams grew dense. They lacked images, lacked narrative, yet pressed with sensation. Weight bore down, lifted, returned. Knees touched unseen surfaces. Hands repeated motions without resistance or sound. There was no fear within these dreams, only completion, repetition carried out with absolute calm. Waking from them left behind a sense of having been used, not violently, but thoroughly. The house responded to this exhaustion with accommodation. Floors adjusted subtly, offering more give where bodies sank each night. Walls seemed to lean inward, reducing the space required to move, to turn, to exist. Door frames resisted less, yielding to touch with a soft, almost elastic response. The building was reshaping itself to fit the men it held. Sweating intensified around the beds. Moisture surfaced in the early hours before dawn, warm and faintly tinted, seeping up through seams and nail holes, darkening the wood beneath mattresses. Sheets absorbed it readily, growing heavy and sour. Attempts to move beds into other rooms failed. Within nights, the same patterns emerged, the house guiding rest back into familiar configurations. Even sound changed. Footsteps dulled, absorbed by the softened floors. Doors closed without echo. The building swallowed noise the way it swallowed residue, leaving behind a thick silence that pressed against ears. Within that silence, the low hum persisted, a vibration felt more than heard, synchronized to something internal, something steady and unyielding. The men began to linger longer in the house during daylight, drawn back between shifts without fully understanding why. The air inside felt easier on the lungs despite its density. Outside, the city grated with noise, light, unpredictability. Inside, everything was moderated, controlled, contained. The house offered rest of a specific kind, one that did not refresh but steadied, smoothing rough edges, pressing agitation flat. Skin contact with surfaces became unavoidable. Palms resting on banisters tingled faintly, warmth transferring instantly. Sitting too long left impressions that persisted after standing, shallow depressions that took minutes to fade. In rare moments of attention, fingers traced these marks and felt a faint resistance, as though the wood were reluctant to let go. The cellar continued its quiet work below. Tools left there emerged damp, their handles darkened permanently. Iron fittings developed a tacky film that resisted cleaning. The smell rose upward through the house at night, threading through corridors, settling thickest near sleeping bodies. It was never overwhelming, never enough to provoke alarm. It simply was. Neighbors noticed the change. The house no longer merely exhaled on certain nights. It radiated consistently now, a low warmth that bled into the street, a sweetness that lingered even when windows were closed. Dogs refused to pass entirely. Stone steps near the entrance grew slick and warm, as if something beneath them shifted restlessly. Within, the men's shadows deepened further, clinging close to their bodies even in strong light. Their movements grew economical, stripped of excess. They spoke less, ate mechanically, conserved energy without conscious intent. Calm settled into them with the same persistence as the scent, methodical and unyielding. What the house was learning was not just routine, but temperament. It absorbed the practiced peace required to perform its former function, the deliberate stillness that accompanied repetition without reflection. This calm pressed into the wood and stone as thoroughly as blood ever had, saturating the structure until it could reproduce the effect. By the time awareness flickered briefly, by the time unease surfaced and was dismissed, the process was complete. The house no longer waited for the men to bring something into it. It drew from them directly. It washed them as they slept, extracting residue invisible to the eye, pressing it into itself, refining its contents. The building did not hunger. It had already been fed. What it did now was maintain balance, redistributing what it held, ensuring nothing spilled, nothing escaped. The exhaustion of its occupants was not a flaw. It was evidence of efficiency. And as the months continued to pass, the house settled deeper into its role, floors soft and responsive, walls dark and warm, air heavy with calm. Those who slept within it did not question the fatigue or the scent clinging to their skin. They rose each morning steady, composed, ready to return to their work, unaware that the house had already claimed the best parts of their rest and stored them carefully, layer by layer, beneath their feet. After the terror ended, the house was sealed with an efficiency that mirrored its former use. Doors were barred, shutters closed, locks installed not to protect what was inside, but to prevent attention. Official records listed the property as unoccupied, unsuitable, awaiting reassignment. No explanation followed. The street adjusted. Neighbors learned to walk past without looking, to ignore the persistent warmth that bled faintly through stone even in winter, to tolerate the sweetness that rose after rain and then faded again, like a breath deliberately taken and released. Years accumulated without ceremony. Regimes shifted. Names vanished from ledgers. The house remained, quiet and intact, its windows blind, its interior held in a prolonged pause. Inside, nothing truly dried. Floors retained their soft give, walls their darkened stains, beams their internal weight. The building no longer exhaled with the same urgency, but it did not empty. What it held had settled deeper, compressed by time rather than released by it. When the decision was finally made to reclaim the property, it was done without curiosity. The order was practical. Paris needed space. The house was structurally sound, well placed, and long unused. Carpenters were sent, men accustomed to rot and neglect, to stripping back surfaces and rebuilding what age had weakened. They arrived expecting vermin, mold, the usual decay of abandonment. The first days revealed little. Dust lay thick, but undisturbed. Furniture had been removed long ago. Walls were bare, their discoloration attributed to damp. The air was warm, strangely so, but the men dismissed it as trapped heat. They opened windows, propped doors, allowed light and air to circulate. The sweetness lingered but thinned, becoming background, something to be ignored. It was when the floors were opened that the house answered. Planks came up reluctantly. Nails resisted extraction, bending and snapping rather than yielding cleanly. The wood beneath was dark, far darker than expected, its surface tacky despite years without visible moisture. As boards were lifted, a smell rose sharply, concentrated now that it was no longer diffused through varnish and time. It was unmistakable. Copper, dulled and sweetened, layered with the faint alkaline bite of soap rendered long ago. Beneath the first layer, the truth began to show. Joists were stained through, their grain blackened unevenly, as though ink had been poured into the wood and allowed to spread without limit. It was not surface damage. The discoloration extended deep, penetrating fibers that should have remained pale and dry. When cut, the wood wept slightly, a thin sheen forming along the fresh edge, warm to the touch. The men paused. Tools were set down. Silence pressed into the space, broken only by the slow settling of the building, a sound like breath released after being held too long. Work continued out of necessity rather than confidence. More boards were removed. The pattern repeated everywhere. Plank after plank bore the same saturation, the same near-black staining that followed no spill pattern, no single source. It was uniform and deliberate, as if applied gradually over time, allowed to soak, reapplied, pressed further in with repetition. Beams beneath showed the same condition. Their surfaces were dark and slick, their interiors heavy. Even stone supports bore discoloration, the mortar between blocks tinted faintly, holding the smell stubbornly. This was not residue. It could not be scrubbed away or cut free. The material itself had been altered. One carpenter attempted to clean a section with water and brush. The liquid ran pink briefly before clearing, leaving the surface unchanged. Another tried lime, then vinegar. The stains remained, unmoved, as if cleanliness were irrelevant to what had occurred here. As the floors opened wider, the house released more. Warmth rose from the exposed structure, fogging breath despite open windows. The smell intensified, filling the rooms with a domestic intimacy that clashed violently with the evidence beneath their feet. It was the scent of labor performed carefully, methodically, without haste. In the cellar, the discovery was worse. Stone walls that had seemed merely dark now revealed themselves as permanently altered. Scraping at the surface did nothing. Chisels bit shallow and met resistance. The stone beneath discolored through its depth. Water seeped from nowhere, pooling faintly at the base, reflecting the men's distorted faces. No bodies were found. No bones. No tools. The house had not kept trophies. It had absorbed. Records were consulted. Old permits, faded lists, half-burned documents surfaced, confirming what had been suspected but never stated. The house had served as quarters for executioners during the height of the terror. Men who worked from dawn until the sky darkened, who returned each night carrying with them what could not be washed from hands alone. What shocked the carpenters was not the knowledge, but the scale. Blood had not been spilled here in violence or chaos. It had been introduced slowly, persistently, tracked in on boots, soaked from clothing, pressed from skin during sleep. Day after day, night after night, until the wood itself had learned to accept it. This was not a spill. It was feeding. The structure had taken in more than blood. Along with it came the calm required to perform the work efficiently. The steadiness. The absence of hesitation. These qualities had pressed into the building as surely as any physical substance, saturating it until the distinction between material and memory dissolved. The house had become heavy with it. Overfilled. When word reached officials, the response was swift and contained. Work was halted. Floors were covered again, hastily, imperfectly. Windows were closed. The house was resealed, its condition recorded vaguely as compromised, unsuitable for habitation. No attempt was made to remove what lay beneath. There was no method to extract saturation from a structure that had been fed for years. To strip it entirely would have meant dismantling the building down to foundation and rubble, and even then the ground itself would have held traces. The house was left intact, its truth pressed back beneath boards and plaster. Over time, renovations elsewhere distracted attention. The street quieted again. The warmth returned to its steady bleed. On certain mornings, when weather shifted abruptly, the floors still sweated faintly, releasing just enough to remind the surface world of what lay beneath. The building did not protest its ceiling. It had already learned patience. What it held was secure, pressed too deep to be erased, waiting not for release but for recognition. Decades passed, then centuries, and Paris reassembled itself layer by layer around the sealed house. Streets were widened, names changed, stone replaced with brick and then with glass. Carriages yielded to engines, oil lamps to electric light. Maps were redrawn until the building appeared only as a blank rectangle, an architectural afterthought surrounded by movement. Yet the house remained, unchanged in proportion and posture, its facade cleaned and repaired just enough to prevent questions, its interior left largely untouched beneath successive skins of renovation. Ownership transferred quietly. The house was leased, sold, reclaimed, reassigned. It served briefly as storage, then as offices, then as temporary lodging for those who required discretion. Each new purpose brought superficial alterations. Walls were repainted. Floors were sanded and resealed. Pipes were replaced. Wires were threaded through cavities never meant to hold them. None of this reached the depth where the house kept itself. In calm times, nothing seemed amiss. Sunlight fell cleanly through windows. Footsteps echoed appropriately. The building held temperature well, an advantage remarked upon approvingly. It was only during sudden changes of weather that the old behavior surfaced. After heavy rain followed by heat, after abrupt cold snapped by warmth, moisture appeared along seams where it should not have been. Floors developed a faint sheen beneath rugs and furniture. Visitors complained of warmth underfoot, of boards that felt almost alive, yielding slightly, and then returning to shape with a delay that unsettled without explaining why. The scent persisted. It rose without warning, a clean, sickly sweetness that carried no obvious source. Cleaning products were blamed. Plumbing was inspected repeatedly. No leak was ever found. The smell did not linger long enough to provoke evacuation or formal complaint. It appeared, asserted itself, then faded, leaving behind discomfort without evidence. Those who stayed overnight experienced a deeper unease. Sleep came quickly, heavily, but delivered no rest. Dreams remained vague yet oppressive, filled with sensation rather than image. Weight. Pressure. Repetition. In the morning, skin felt slick, as though washed and dried without memory of the act. Showers did little to dispel the faint metallic trace that clung to wrists and throats. Records did not acknowledge any of this. Official documents described the building as unremarkable. No registry mentioned its former function. What survived existed only as fragments, rumors repeated without context, dismissed as exaggeration. The house had learned long ago how to remain undocumented. What no record admitted was that the building had not merely absorbed blood. It had taken in something far more durable. Along with the physical residue came the calm required to produce it efficiently. The practiced stillness of men who learned to perform violence without agitation, to repeat the act until it became process rather than event. This calm had pressed into the structure as steadily as any fluid, saturating wood, stone, and mortar until the house itself could reproduce the effect. The guillotine had stopped. The crowds had dispersed. The men were long dead. Yet the calm remained, embedded so deeply that it required no living presence to activate it. The house had learned how to create stillness, how to extract agitation and replace it with quiet compliance. It no longer needed executioners. It had internalized their function. Those who spent extended time inside began to change subtly. They moved with greater economy, wasted fewer gestures. Emotions flattened into something manageable and even. Anxiety dulled. Anger lost its edge. Decisions were made without hesitation, without reflection. The effect was often welcomed at first, mistaken for clarity, for relief. In offices housed there during one brief period, productivity rose while conversation dwindled. Workers stayed late without resentment, completed tasks with mechanical focus, and left with no memory of fatigue. Complaints ceased. So did laughter. When the lease ended, none requested to remain. Later, when the building was converted into short-term lodging, guests praised its quiet. They slept deeply, woke composed, and departed without lingering. Some returned repeatedly, drawn by a sense of order they could not articulate. Others left early, unsettled by dreams they could not recall and a persistent sense that something had been done to them gently, thoroughly, while they were not watching. The house did not discriminate. It worked on anyone who entered with equal patience. It did not harm. It refined. Excess emotion was pressed out slowly, redistributed into the structure, adding to the dense equilibrium it maintained. Each visitor contributed a fraction. Each stay reinforced the internal balance. Over time, the sweating became less noticeable. The floors no longer bloomed red, even faintly. The smell softened further, losing its metallic edge and leaning fully into something clean and neutral. Soap without memory. Iron without sharpness. What remained was calm distilled to its purest form. Urban legends surfaced occasionally. Stories of a building that made people feel too quiet, too controlled. These were dismissed as imagination, as the byproduct of old stone and suggestion. Tours passed nearby without stopping. The house remained omitted from narratives of violence, its history too neatly erased to inspire curiosity. What was never considered was that the building no longer needed to remember actively. It had moved beyond recollection into function. It continued the work not out of obligation or hunger, but because repetition had shaped it irrevocably. Cleansing had become its natural state. During one particularly violent summer storm centuries after its sealing, a power outage darkened the district. Rain hammered the street. Inside the house, moisture rose as it always had, but more evenly now, controlled. Floors warmed. Air thickened. Those sheltering within slept heavily through the chaos outside. By morning, they woke calm. Sirens wailed elsewhere. News traveled fast. Inside the house, breakfast was prepared methodically. Movements were efficient. Voices, when used, were low and unnecessary. No one remarked on the faint scent lingering in the corridors. The city continued to modernize. Protests flared and faded. Violence erupted in other quarters, loud and chaotic. The house remained untouched, a pocket of absolute stillness embedded in motion. It did not scream. It did not bleed. It did not display its past. The building had learned what the blade had taught its first occupants, that violence, refined enough, could be silent, clean, and endlessly repeatable. What it offered now was not death, but rest so complete it erased resistance. The guillotine was gone. The men were dust. Yet the work continued, perfected, invisible, a place where nothing needed to be raised or struck again, because everything that entered learned how to lie still.